Hey everybody, how's it going? Today I thought it would be a good idea to break down some different styles of playing on bass and approach it to you bass. But there are a whole bunch of styles that you come across as a bass player, and you've got to know a lot of different styles in order to play a variety of different gigs. And right now we're not really playing very many gigs, but now's a really good time to kind of work on things that you're kind of weak on. Like if you know how to play a couple of styles like country or blues, that's great, but there are a whole bunch of other styles that you can learn and add to that. So for me, I've ended up having to play a lot of different things and kind of just know which styles to pull from. Basically when you're trying to come up with bass lines for songs, like if you're learning things on the spot, or things of that nature. So just a kind of an overview of some styles that I recommend learning about are bossa nova, jazz, funk, blues, country, maybe some basic ideas of metal, reggae. So I'm going to go over a few of those things and like what makes these different styles. And then what I plan on doing is kind of taking one chord progression and approaching that chord progression from the perspective of these different styles. So if you like stuff like that, I have a lot of stuff like this on the channel. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to the channel, or you can just hang out here, just whatever you want to do. So let's jump into it. I think we'll start with some styles that are very basic and straightforward, and just some things that kind of apply to every style. And when I say every style, there's always an exception, so I should say most styles, but you get the idea. Hey, Robert, how's it going? So depending on where you're at in the world, you might come across some styles that I don't mention, but I'm going to try to mention just some ideas. And if you have some ideas for ones that I've missed, you can feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll be glad to try to explain them if I understand what the styles are and everything. Hi, Jeff, how's it going? So let's just start with like some basic pop grooves. So I'm just going to do all these things over a 1-5-6-4 progression in the key of C. So if we were playing along with a ukulele player, a guitar player, or a piano player, they would be playing a C chord, a G chord, an A minor chord, and an F chord. So the first thing we need to know in pretty much any style that we play is where those notes are on the neck. So I'm just going to make it easy and just give you one way to play them, although there are multiple places you can play them at. So let's play this C. This is 3rd fret on the A string. Now I think we want to do the G down here. Then we'll go to an A for the A minor chord. We've got the root of A, and that'll be the 5th fret on the E string. So let me start over. 3rd fret on the A string is a C. 3rd fret on the E string is a G. 5th fret on the E string is an A. And then we'll use the 1st fret on the E string as an F. And then just to give you an idea, we can do an octave up from each one of those notes. So if we have this C, we can go over 2 frets and down 2 strings. And when I say down, I really mean up in pitch, down toward the floor. So let me say this differently. You go over 2 frets and then to 2 strings thinner. So it's kind of like a little square, 2 frets, 2 strings. So if you have the 3rd fret on the E string, 3rd fret on the A string, that's a C. And then the octave up is the 5th fret on the G string. So we just need to be able to find those octaves first. And then on our E string, we've got the 3rd fret on the E string is a G. Then the 5th fret on the D string is an octave up from there. So see, we went over 2 frets and up 2 strings, or over 2 strings thinner. Then for the A, we've got the 5th fret on the E string. We could also go to the 7th fret on the D string. That's that octave. And then for F, 1st fret on the E string, we could go over 2 frets into 2 strings thinner. And we've got the 3rd fret on the D string at that point. So now that we've got our idea of octaves, we can play stuff kind of in different places once we go through these styles. So I'm trying to think, I think pop and basic rock would be the easiest things to start with. because we don't really need to know any other notes other than those root notes to play certain songs in those styles as a very like beginner line. We really just need to know a rhythm that we can play with those. So let's say we're staying on each one for one measure and we're playing at about this tempo, 1, 2, 3, 4. So like a basic pop or kind of basic rock drum beat, you might have one that sounds like boom, pop, boom, boom, pop. So the boom is the bass drum, bass, snare, bass, bass, snare. So that's a really common rhythm. So if you hear that bass pattern on the drums, or even if you don't, this is just something that you can do if you're imitating the drums. Like if you're in a ukulele ensemble and you don't have a drummer there, then you could do that. You can kind of just imitate those things. But basically, you could just play what the bass drum does. So if the bass is going 1, 3, and 1, 3, and, then we can go 1, 3, and 1, 3, and. So that would be like our basic rock style. So one measure would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2. So a basic pop or a basic rock rhythm. And hey, Seth, how's it going? Today we're just talking about different styles. So I'm just talking about some common styles that I think people should know. I think we're going to cover, I'm starting with like basic rock and pop. I'm thinking about doing country next, funk, blues, maybe a tiny bit of jazz, bossa nova, just to give the basic idea of kind of what you can expect from each style. And as a bass player, what you need to know. I know, Seth, you probably know a lot of this stuff, but it might be a fun review. So yeah, that's what we're going over today. And hey, Novix, how's it going? Good to see you. It's going pretty good. So we'll jump back into different styles. Yes, that's all I mean. Musical styles. Yep. So we've got that basic kind of pop rock groove where we're just going 1, 3, and we can apply that to all our changes. So if something feels like it would have that drum groove underneath it, you can always do that. Another common one is like, I mean, you can do a lot with the root notes, basically. You could just play on beats 1 and beats 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or you could do something a little bit busier. I guess I'm going to show one other one. You can go boom, 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 boom. That one's really similar to the first one, but the timing's a little bit different. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, and 4 like we did originally, you could do and 3. So like 1, 2, and 3, 4. 1, 2, and 3. So you have that rhythm in addition too. Yeah, so this would be a good one to have drums to. I'm just going to imitate the drums, kind of give you an idea of what it is, and then give you an idea of how to play along to it. So the drum part might sound like, once again, you got the bass drum, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop. This one that we just went over is boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop. And boom is the bass drum, pop is the snare drum. So there's that. So boom, pop, boom, boom, pop. You just want to lock in with whatever rhythm the bass drum is doing. We don't really play the pop. Okay. Unless the bass drum does too. Unless the bass drum plays at the same time as the snare drum. That's what I'm trying to say. If that was confusing. Okay. And so Navik says he's got some built-in drum loops. Yeah. So what I think you could do that would really just help, just as far as any jam situation you end up in the future, is practicing with that drum loop, any of the drum loops, and identify what the bass drum is doing on each loop. So if you have a basic rock one, is it going boom, pop, boom, boom, pop? Or is it going like boom, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, boom, boom? And there's I don't have the sheet music for it, but there was a beginner drum book, and basically it just plays all the different bass drum rhythms that you'd expect on eighth note grooves for the drums. And it's like, the hi-hat and the snare are staying the same, and it would just have all the different variations of the bass drum that you could do with eighth notes. And maybe it didn't do all of them, but it did all the common ones. So another one is you could have one that's busier. It's like boom, boom, pop, boom, 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 pop, which means anytime you're not hitting a snare, any eighth note that you're not hitting a snare on, you're hitting a bass drum on. So then you could kind of jam with that. Boom, boom, pop, boom, 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 pop. So if you're playing with a drummer, you can do that. But I kind of recommend, since a lot of you guys are playing with ukulele groups that don't have a drummer, or with guitar players and not a drummer, you know, when you do jam with people, that you might have to pretend to be the bass drum. So instead of locking in with the bass drum, you're deciding what that groove is. So I almost feel like it's important for you guys to learn a tiny bit about drums and just know these patterns. So that page started with just a bass drum on beat 1 and a bass drum on beat 3. Then it went bass drum on 1. It probably went bass drum on all downbeats. So 4 on the floor beat, which just means every quarter note you're doing bass drum. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Jazz kind of has that feel from the bass, since the bass is walking quarter notes. And then a lot of dance music will have like disco and things of that nature might have a 4 on the floor drum groove, and we'll lock in with at least that note. But if we were doing disco, we would fill in the other eighth notes in between those quarter notes with an octave up. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm jumping around and giving you disco right now. If we have that same progression, we just do a root and an octave above it, and you could double either one of those. Yeah. So that's kind of a thing, just being able to go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then you can double them with 16th notes, which is what I was doing. So you can go 1, 2. So 1 and a 2 and 3 and a 4 and 1 and a 2 and 3 and a 4 and 1 and a 2 and 3 and a 4 and. Or you could double the lower note. Yeah, so you can kind of do variations of that, and that's disco. So I jumped from rock to disco really quickly, but the idea is just locking in with the bass drum in general. So now let's move on to country real quick. So old school country stuff is usually kind of like either fast or slow, it doesn't matter, but it's in 4/4, and it's usually a boom pop rhythm, which means the bass drum's on beat 1 and beat 3. And so you could sit there and just literally play 1, 2, 3, 4 and lock in with just that bass drum with root notes. But people get bored of that pretty quickly, right? Just as a bass player, if all you did was play root notes with the chords, and that was your only rhythm that you were playing, that would get pretty stale after a while. So in country, what they did, and a couple other styles too, country's not the only one, country, bluegrass, polka, there's a 2-feel in jazz kind of uses this idea too. But all of those different styles use a root and a fifth. And so, you know, and then they fill in the gaps with little walk-ups, and we can talk about that too and what they're doing. But the general idea of the style is you're playing a root on beat 1 and a fifth of the chord on beat 3. And then there are variations. If your fifth happens to be the root of the next chord you're going to, you may want to play a different note to not make it sound redundant. Let me just do the root fifth line, and then we can talk about those exceptions. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you're doing country, a lot of times it's really more like a quarter note, a quarter rest, and then a quarter note, and then a quarter rest. So you play the note, then you have silence in between rather than just holding it out, so that it kind of has a little bounce to it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's going through our progression of C, G, A minor, F, C, the fifth, G, the fifth of that chord. And I should tell you what the fifth is, because some of you guys know, but not everybody may know this. So a fifth is, it's an interval from a major scale, from the root of the scale to the fifth note of the scale, but the pattern always ends up being the same distance on the bass, since we have all our strings tuned at the same interval. So basically, if you have the 3rd fret on the A string, you go over 2 frets and then to 1 string thinner. And that note's going to be the fifth of that. So C is our root of our chord, and then we go 2 frets over and 1 string thinner, and that's the fifth of that chord. You could also, instead of going there, you could take that fifth down the octave. So that would be going 2 strings thicker and minus 2 frets. So our fifth is either here or our fifth of C could be here. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Just memorize those two patterns. We're going up a fifth or we're going down to the fifth. Okay. So if I were to play a country line where all the chords went down to the fifth, you'd end up with this. C. Well, okay, I can't do it for G, actually. You know, with C, then you have a G right there. Then you'd start on that G, but we don't have a lower fifth, so I'd have to go up the fifth there. Then the A minor, root fifth. The fifth's the same whether it's a minor chord or major chord. And then F. So you can go up a fifth for every chord. Or if we stay in a higher octave, we could go down for each chord. So C going down to the fifth, a G up here going down to its fifth, an A, it's kind of hard to show you on here, so I'll do it up higher, and then an F going down to the fifth. And the fifth of F is a C, if you look at that. So some of these things kind of, if you loop them back to back, you end up with a really redundant sounding thing where you get to you hit the fifth of one chord and it becomes the root of the next chord and it gets kind of monotonous, like it's kind of strange. So what you may want to do is double the root on the measures where you know that the fifth of that root is the same as the chord you're going to. So let me give an example of what I mean. If you're going from a C chord and then the next measure doing a G chord, then we may just want to play two C's and then go to the G and play the fifth of that one. Because if we go to a C, then to a G, we're already on the G and we're hitting it again. And that might sound a little bit redundant. And I know you might be like, well, why not just hit the fifth twice like that instead of hitting the root twice? Well, if you hit the root twice, it's really showing you that you were on that chord and really like outlining the C chord well, just letting people know you're definitely on a C chord and then you're definitely moving to a G chord. But if you hit the fifth twice, some people might think that you just moved to the G chord too soon, or your ear might recognize it as that, and that might make it, I don't know, it just doesn't sound as strong of a bass line. So you could go root, root, fifth, root, root, new chord, root, fifth, root, 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 fifth. You could do that kind of thing. And then from there, we can add little walk-ups between there for country lines. I've already done a video on the walk-ups, but the idea is you figure out what key all of your chords are more or less in. So like in this case, if we do a C, a G, an A minor, and F, every note within all of those chords is in the key of C major. We could go, and it would take a longer lesson, I think, to teach why. But just know that. So if we use our C major scale, and we know what the note names are, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and we know that all these chords consist of notes that are in that scale, you could also figure out what those same notes are down low. C going backwards, B, A, G, F, E, and then, oh, we ran out of notes, but we could have a D and a C going backwards down the scale. So just knowing that you can use those notes down low or those notes going higher. We can just fill in the gaps between chords with little quarter note walks. So most of what we're doing is half notes or notes on beat 1 and beat 3. It's really a quarter note, a quarter rest, a quarter note, a quarter rest. But we could fill in those rests with walks that get us to the next chord. So we could go root. So we got root, third. Okay, we can't do that one. Let me start with the simple one. Root, root, fifth, 6, 6, 5, 4. So what I did there was I walked from that A down the scale by hitting an extra A instead of hitting the fifth. Or you could go right. But I like this better. So I hit two roots and then filled in that rest with a G, going from A going to an F chord. A, G, F. And then hitting the fifth of that. So that's something you can kind of do too, is you can kind of fill in the gaps really quickly with that. Or you could take a whole entire measure and walk up using 4 notes, which I have a whole video on this once again. So you could go from the C to the G chord. You could just walk up the C major scale to G. Right? And then certain ones you don't have that option and certain ones you do. Yet again, check out the walk-ups thing. It gives you all the different variations. But country usually just has beats 1 and 3 with the occasional walk up in certain parts, and you kind of use it kind of at the end of phrases to let you know you're coming back around to the top of a repeated phrase, like if you end the verse and you're going into a chorus, or if you're ending half of a verse and going back into the verse for the second verse, you can kind of use those little walk-ins to mark where that you're moving into a new section. Mr. Mayonnaise, I like to eat dirt. Interesting. All right, so I'm gonna go up to let's see, what does Seth have to say about some things? My problem with playing basic rhythms like that is trying to be funky. Okay. Right. So the root note stuff is boring, and we're talking about this. We'll get to funk in a minute, and we can kind of mess around with it. This stuff's more simple. Oh, another thing that you could do with country is you can add ghost notes in to make it a little bit more interesting. You know, sorry. All right. So we got a whole lot of things. So that's kind of country in a nutshell. You can add ghost notes in if you want to, just to spice it up a little bit. But those ghost notes are just like boom, da-dun, kind of almost like a swung eighth note, just thrown in really quickly in between. Okay, so probably enough on country. That gives you a basic idea there. Let's take this idea of a root and fifth. In a jazz context, you'd use more chromatic notes getting from one chord to another. So you could do the same root and fifth. You might sustain the notes longer rather than giving them that bounce, depending on what era you're trying to play music from. Like 1920s jazz, you probably would still give it that bounce that the country music has, but more modern stuff, you might sustain the notes instead. So if we were doing, we might do. It's not really going to sound jazzy because it's not really a jazzy chord progression. It's really, no matter what we do, it's going to sound like wagon wheel, but you get the idea. And then Andrea says, how about bluegrass? Bluegrass is kind of the same thing with the country stuff that we were doing a second ago. One thing that you could do as a variation that I hear more in bluegrass than I do in country is adding a slapped ghost note on instead of those rests in between. So, you know, that kind of thing. So. And so you can add those little walk-ins, the same kind of thing, but you could add kind of a ghost note in between if you wanted to. And yet again, that's just imitating the snare drum. So before we're playing what the bass drum would play, and then the slap kind of sounds like a snare drum. So there's always like a low sound and a high sound that kind of go together in percussion things to just balance each other out, really. So it's like bass and treble. You know, it's the same kind of thing as having bass instruments and treble instruments. They just kind of balance each other out. So hopefully that helps a little bit. But that's the idea. That's kind of the difference. Bluegrass and country are very similar in that regard. It's just the progressions might be a little bit different in bluegrass, but the approach is kind of the same. And you may be able to be a little bit more busy and do more walk-ups on bluegrass rather than country, because some country is more about just staying minimal. And bluegrass, since everybody else is playing a lot more, you might be able to get away with doing more walks and longer walks. But in general, they're very similar styles. Okay, so now that we've got that down, I'm going to skip over to bossa nova. Now, you might be like, why are we skipping to something that we've played pop, we played country, and now we're going to a specific style of groove. A lot of people, and this is kind of a really dumbed down thing, and I'm sure it sounds like, an ignorant American thing to say, but a lot of times people will just say like this song's a Latin song. And that can mean a lot of different things, like style. This song's a Latin style. And that can mean a bunch of different things, but in general, if you see that, a bossa nova bass line will probably work on it. Okay. It might sound like, you're not a legit player of the style, but it does work with the song. But, so it's a place to start, basically. And then if you want to delve into those styles and know specifically, is it a bossa nova? Is it a samba? Is it a Yeah, if I try to list a bunch of styles, I'm probably just gonna sound like I don't know the names of enough styles. So we'll just kind of go with that. But you get the idea. There's a whole bunch of things, and they all have slightly different grooves. And sometimes I know what to play, but not necessarily the names of that. Yeah, so Latin jazz is basically what I'm saying. When people say Latin jazz, a lot of the times they're saying this is a bossa nova. And then yeah, when they say Latin, it's kind of just a simplification kind of thing. And so this is something that works. You see this in like the real book, which is a fake book. You know, it's like the most well-known fake book is called the real book. Kind of a little joke there in their title, I guess, of what they did. But basically, it gives you the melody, it gives you the chords above the melody, and then over in the corner, it gives you the style. And so it'll say like ballad, swing, or Latin a lot of times, or sometimes it'll say funk. You know, it'll just give you the style up in the corner, and then you have the melody. And so the style lets you know if we're swinging eighth notes or doing straight eighth notes. Well, in the Latin kinds of stuff, if it says Latin in the corner or bossa nova in the corner, we're doing straight eighth notes, not swung eighth notes. And we're doing, in general, a line that works with it, a very simplistic thing, is still roots and fifths. We just double each one, except when we're at the beginning, we're just going to play a single root, and then we're going to play 2 fifths. And the rhythm's going to be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Yeah, and so then you have an and leading back into the top. So that and is usually the root of whatever the next chord is, like you're slightly anticipating the new chord. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. This progression's not very Latin sounding, but you get the idea. Yeah, so it doesn't really make it sound that Latin if the progression's kind of just a normal pop progression, but it gives you the idea. Yeah, and so Seth says sounds like elevator music. Kind of. I mean, a lot of times people are like, well, what creates a positive vibe? Well, we want to make people feel like they're not in an elevator, right? We want to, so you might give them a tropical sort of vibe, or you might give them a Latin kind of vibe where things are just slightly more interesting than that. But in the same sense, since it's elevator music and it's not trying to draw attention to it, it's the blandest version of those things usually, right? So so this is like a bland progression, 1 5 6 4, but we're applying the simplest bossa nova groove we can do, right? And so if we just stay on one chord, it's more obvious kind of the feel. But that's the idea. So you're doing root, fifth, root, fifth. And when you change chords, you change on the and to 4, and that gives it kind of this extra drive that makes it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to use a different progression. I'm going to do a 1 chord to so I'm going to do a minor chord, right? C minor to E flat major. And then I'm going to do like a D diminished chord going to a G 7 chord, basically. Diminished has a flat fifth, so that's why these aren't completely spread out fifths. Right, and Seth's got a good example of a song that he mentioned in the chat. Girl from Ipanema. Tall and tan and young. Gosh, I should not sing, but you get the idea. I should not sing that one. Rosa, that's actually that chord. But yeah, that's an example of a song that a bossa nova groove works really well on. And you know, basically these style ideas that I'm giving you would help if you had a fake book, basically, that tells you the chords, tells you the melody, and in the corner it tells you the style. This is kind of the skill that I'm teaching you right now, is how to fake your way through songs that you've never played before and maybe never heard. You know, so that's an example. So if you see that, then if you see Latin jazz or you see bossa nova in the corner, that will probably work with it, unless there's a specific line spelled out for you to play that they want you to do differently. However, if you went to the places where the music originated, you know, if you went to Brazil, or if you went to just all sorts of other places, you know, they would probably think it was a pretty lame bass line if that's all you did. There's a whole, you know, kind of stylistic thing around it, where to do certain fills, where to vary the rhythm up. And for the sake of this video, we're not going to get into that. And I'm not going to pretend to be a master of all those styles and knowing all the different stuff. But it's kind of fun doing like boom, 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 boom. So like putting a note on beat 4 and going to the next chord on beat 4 and then hanging out on it and a little bit longer allows the song to breathe in certain places. But there are lots of variations that people throw in. It's not just that one. That's just an example of making it slightly less vanilla, right? So that's a basic idea on Latin jazz. So now we've gone over country, bluegrass. Technically a 2-feel for jazz changes, you know, is kind of a lot like country. We went over disco, and then now we've gone over the bossa nova, Latin jazz kind of thing. So let's talk about if we were doing swing. So swing jazz, kind of like this is where you have a walking bass line. This is harder to kind of just explain and break down in one video like this. So I'm going to give you an example of one, but it's not going to sound very jazzy again, because a 1-5-6-4 is really a pop progression and not a jazz progression. But here's a way a jazz player might approach it. See if I can even do that really well. Let's see. What would a jazz player do over that? It's not really a typical thing. That's not very jazzy. Let's see. Ooh, that's kind of tough. That's not a 4-chord though. You gotta go to a 4-chord. Man, I keep wanting to do things that go. Jazz typically uses a 2-5-1 progression, so a lot of these walking lines are really more made for that style of progression of moving in fourths instead of going to a fifth like we're doing here. So I'll just try it anyway. That's not a really good ending, but you get the idea. So it's like we're using more chromatic notes, but we're filling in notes within the scale. I made a live stream about walking lines, but you basically want to outline the chord as much as you can. So here I'm playing the root and the third, and then the rest of the notes are getting me into that new chord, that G chord. So I'm just, you know, hitting 2 notes that are in the C chord, the C and an E, and then walking chromatically into a G, because I need 4 beats, you know, 3 beats after the root to get to each new one. And so then when I get here, it's kind of like I'm trying to kill time, basically, because this chord is so close. You could go, you could do that kind of thing, or you could go. So that would be kind of a cool thing. I'm hitting the root of the chord, then going to the third of the chord, then back to the root of the chord, and then chromatically walking into the next root, which is an A. So that's a pretty good line there. And then getting from here down to the 4 chord and having it sound jazzy is kind of the tricky part. So I guess in jazz, a lot of these chords would be 7th chords instead of just being root 3rd, 5th. We'd add a 7th to it, so we could use the flat 7th to help get down there. That'd actually be a good line. That's not what I played. What did I just do a second ago? I don't like that one as much. Let's see. I mean, you could do something with the arpeggio like that. But it's nice if it leads nicely into it. So I kind of want to hit the 5th of the chord, which is an E, right before going in. So I could go root, 3rd, root, 5th. So it's kind of just doing an arpeggio kind of thing. And if I did a 7th chord, I could do root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and then slide down there. So you can use arpeggios, you can use chromatics to get there, but it's hard to make a really pop progression sound jazzy like that. You kind of gotta kind of do something a little bit differently, because usually the intervals are a little further or closer in pop rather than being the same size like they often are in jazz until you change key, basically. Okay. So I'm just giving you an example of how you could approach a well, okay, so Glenn, I'm trying to give you an example of how you can approach one progression with all these styles, and that's the main reason. I could do a 2-5-1-6. I could do, you're saying 1-6-2-5. Yeah, I could have done that one, but yeah, I mean, all that stuff, right? But I'm trying to figure out if you can still apply these styles to anything. So I wanted to keep a pop progression going, basically, just for the sake of the exercise. So I'm just going to walk into the 5, to the 6, and then here I like walking back chromatically into C. So that's kind of a cool thing you can do too. So that just gives you kind of an example. You're playing quarter notes. You're using scales and chromatics to walk into the root of the next chord, and then also some arpeggios when you just need some extra things, because arpeggios are using chord tones, so it lines it up. So that's the idea on that one. And yeah, just anything like good examples of songs to walk over. Seth has "Take the A Train" on there. So yeah, you're staying on C for a while, then you go to a D major chord, and it goes D minor, G. Right? So you can do that kind of thing. I'm just going to do the A section and kind of end it. But you kind of get the idea. You're using a combination of arpeggios, walking up and down the scale, and occasionally bridging the gaps between notes with chromatics. And in jazz, we like chromatics more than we do in country. So that's just kind of a thing. Anytime that you can do a chord substitution or do something different to get more chromatic notes, it's jazzier rather than country. Okay, so we've done jazz now. I think that'll take us to the blues. With the blues, you basically just want to understand the song form. So the blues, you can't really do over this progression. So all this attempt of trying to do a 1-5-6-4, it's going to have to get thrown out the window for blues, because you're not going to be playing blues and play a 1-5-6-4. Blues has to do more with the kind of chord progression that you're playing underneath it. So we're going to go with the most common blues progression for this. You might do a walking line in some blueses. You have swing style blueses where you're playing quarter notes, but they're less about doing all the walks and more about like walking into new chords, and more about taking a pattern and moving it around to the different chord progression. So I guess you could say if you made all those chords dominant seventh chords or something, and you had like a, kind of thing, you could make it sound bluesy, but turning all of them into dominant seventh chords is kind of weird. Yeah, you get the idea. It's a little weird. 6 and then 4, I guess. You would never really do that, so I'm just going to give you a 12-bar blues progression. Just kind of take a break from this progression. We'll come back to it with other genres. And honestly, with funk, you might stay on one chord a lot longer. So when we get to funk, we might just do a one chord thing to give you an idea. So with the blues, your 12-bar blues progression, if we were in the key of C, we'd be playing, let's just talk about our C major scale real quick, because we're going to have to kind of go through this. We've got a C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And so if we gave each one of those a number within the scale, saying this is the first note of the scale, so it's 1 being the first, 2 being the second note of the scale, 3 being the third note of the scale, 4 being the fourth note, and 5th being the 5th, and so on. But this is all we really need for this. I'm going to tell you we're going to be using a 1, a 4 chord, and a 5 chord. A 1 chord, 4 chord, and a 5 chord in this. So our 1 chord is going to be a chord built off of the first note in the scale, which is C. Our 4 chord is going to be built off of the fourth note in the scale, which is F in this case. And then our 5 chord is going to be built off of a G. And we're going to play a pattern and then move it around to those other spots based on this particular progression that I'm about to tell you. So it's called a 12-bar blues because there are 12 measures. Okay? So we might have a pattern that's 1 measure long. Let's just go with that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and right. And then we can play that. You play the 1 chord for 4 measures. Then you play the 4 chord for 2 measures. Then you play the 1 chord for 2 measures. Then you go to the 5 chord for 1 measure, the 4 chord for 1 measure, and then the 1 chord at the end for 2. All right. So play a lot of different instruments. I think this can. The answer is yes. It's an acoustic electric, but I do have one. I do play it a lot, but I play U-bass more often. But yes, I do play the ukulele too. Okay, so back to this. We have a pattern, and then we have our progression being. We're going to play the pattern 4 times on the 1 chord. So here's our pattern. Or what was it? I think that was all I was doing. So that's a C, E, G, B flat, A. And another thing, all these chords are going to be 7th chords, dominant 7th chords. So that's why there's a B flat in there, if you're wondering. And the blues doesn't really technically stay in one key. It's like each chord is what matters, and then how far away they are from each other. But you could argue that since they're all dominant 7th chords, we're going to have notes in the other chords that aren't all in this one key. Okay, so here we go. We're going to play it 4 times. This is number 2, 3, 4. Now we're going to go to the 4 chord. So we need to find an F where we can play that pattern. If we try to do it down here, we run out of notes. We can play it down here, but one of our notes would have to be an open string. Actually, 2 of them, right? Because if we put our middle finger there and try to play the same finger pattern that we were playing on the 1st chord down here, our pointer finger would be playing open strings. So we might as well just play them open and not pretend there's a fret there or something. So that's one way to do it. Or we could find an F that's higher up, and that would be like the 8th fret on the A string. So learning your fretboard might help a lot with this. So I'll do it up here for now just to give you an idea, and then I'll play, when I get to the G chord, I'll play that pattern down here. But it's 4 times through the 1st chord. We go to our 4 chord here, 2, 3, here we go. And we go back to our 1 chord, then to our 5 chord, to our 4 chord, to our 1 chord. In the basic blues, we just stay on the 1 chord 2 times at the end. Sometimes people like to mark that it's the ending before they go back to the beginning. So they might do something different, like a da-da-da, to let you know that they're going back in. So that would sound like on the last 2 measures of the piece. So just the last measures. So you have some sort of way to mark that you're at the end of the form and going back to the beginning of the 12-bar form. So that's how you'd play maybe a swing style blues is what you could call it. You use the same 12-bar idea, but it's kind of like if you're doing a shuffle, then the notes might be swung. The 8th notes might be swung. Da, 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 and you might have a pattern that uses 8th notes. So here's an example of a shuffle groove. Do the same thing where you do the same number on the 1 chord, then you go up to the 4 chord, back to the 1 chord, to the 5 chord, 4 chord. I'm gonna do it down here to the 1 chord. And you can still do that little turnaround at the end. So that's some things about blues. Some other things that you might want to know about blues is how do you end a blues song? You play that pattern over and over and over again, throughout the song. But then at the very end of the song, there might be a few different endings that you just want to have ready to go, to be able to end the song. One of them is, if you're doing a shuffle, you could do that. Or that one. So first one would be like C, E, F, F sharp, G. So it ends up being like third fret on the A string with the middle finger, since that's the root of our song, basically the root of our key, tonic, the first note in our key. And then we go to the third of that chord, which in this case would be an E, second fret on the D string. And then we just chromatically walk in, which means not skipping over any frets, just one by one, into the fifth fret, or the fifth of the key, rather. But it happens to be the fifth fret on the D string in this key. And then we have two options. We can either play the sixth, the seventh, and the root of the major scale that we're in, or we can, from that fifth, go to the sharp root, which means we're playing a C, we do a C sharp instead, and then a C at the end. So those are just some endings. If you're doing quarter notes, you can do that. If you're doing a swung kind of rhythm, you can double each note up to the G and then just do single notes at the end. So that's a couple of endings that you can do. That's just kind of like your normal blues shuffle, and your normal swing blues was what I did right before them. And then you could do something called a slow blues. And a slow blues is exactly kind of what it sounds like. It's much slower than that. And you're in the time signature 12/8, which you could think about as being like a slow 4 split into triplets. So like you go triplet, 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 triplet. So I was just a little too slow. I kind of sped it up there because I don't really want to go triplet, triplet. So we'll do like triplet, 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 triplet. And then you have a pattern that kind of fits within that. So here's an example of a pattern that might work there. So if I go triplet, 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 that's my go-to slow blues pattern. And then you apply that to the 12-bar changes with maybe one exception, or really two exceptions. Most 12-bar blueses will have what's called a quick change, which means instead of doing 4 of the one chord in a row, that second one of them, so first one, second one, you're going to go to the 4 chord there just for that one measure, and then go back to one chord. So it ends up being 1 4 1 1, 4 4 1 1, 5 4, and then here's the other part. Instead of going 1 1 at the end, you might have some extra changes thrown in just because it's so slow there. So by adding some extra chords in there, you're kind of making it more interesting. Usually the extra chords they add is like on the last measure, they have 2 chords per measure, splitting it up in half. And it goes from the 1 chord to the 4 chord to the 1 chord to the 5 chord. And there are a lot of cool guitar lines like dun, 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 dun. So dun, 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 dun. Works with that progression. So so the whole 12-bar blues might take a while to get through, but why not? We'll do it. We're going to do this pattern. Right? So we'll do that. Dun, dun, dun. I left off the last note. And we're going to just take that all the way around the changes. I'm going to use the F down here, which means that my pattern is kind of offset by the fact that I'm using some open strings, but it really is the same pattern. It's just whatever I was playing over here with my pointer finger is now an open string. And so for that reason, rather than having my hand all the way over here, I'm using my pointer finger to do the notes that my middle finger was getting when I was in the 1 chord pattern. And my ring finger would get the notes that my pinky was getting in this pattern. So hopefully that makes sense. So it'd be first fret on the E string 2 times, open A string, 3rd fret on the A string, 1st fret on the D string, open D string, and 3rd fret on the A string. So hopefully that kind of helps. So hopefully you can kind of sort of see how that's the same pattern, even though I'm using open strings to kind of fill out what my pointer finger would have been doing in the other place. Okay. And then everything else is just the pattern until we get to the last 2 bars. And I might do something more like, where I'm walking in between the notes, but I'm really going from the root to the 4th, to the root, to the 5th, And so I could add little walk-ins to get there, or I could just go boom, ba, boom, 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 which is a little boring. So I like adding walks to there, and most people in the blues genre will kind of walk chromatically into different things, or use the arpeggios to get from one chord to the other. But I'll give an example of it, and we can just kind of do that. So let's try playing through a slow blues for the whole slow progression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's that quick change. Back to the one chord. Now we're at the 4 chord 2 times. Back to the 1 chord. Five chords G to the 4 chord, and the last 2 measures. And then back to the top. Does that kind of make sense to you guys? Now, everybody got quiet in the chat, so I'm wondering if y'all are following along or just kind of confused. I know my little turnaround thing, I'm going to explain it after we get done. I'm going to give you an ending this time. So here's an ending. Cool. Okay. Glad y'all are enjoying it. Is it distorting, by the way? Is it too loud for the microphone, or is it sounding pretty good over there? Let me know, because I know that sometimes I play back the live streams later just to check on how the audio was, and I know the bass distorts sometimes. So let me know if it's distorting. Cool. Okay. So yeah, you kind of get the idea there. So basically the last 2 measures, I went like the first time around. The second time I replaced it with that ending that we already talked about, which is the really cheesy one. I do those last 3 notes. The less cheesy one is, but you could do either one. Most people will probably choose the less cheesy one on a slow blues, though. So here what I did on that turnaround, not the ending, but the turnaround. I hit 3 of the C's, C, C, C. Then I hit an E to a G, and then landed on an F. So how did this work? I'm basically doing a C arpeggio. I'm just taking these 2 notes down the octave. So I could have gone C, E, G, which are the notes in a C major chord. Right? So what I'll do is I'll go C, 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 down to E, up to G. So I can end up on this F instead, because we're a bass player. We want to stay in the low register. And then I'm hitting 3 Fs total. 1, 2, 3. And then I'm kind of walking up. You could call it a C mixolydian mode, or you could call it an F major scale to get back to C. But I'm going from but I'm skipping over the second note of the scale. So I'm really going F, then hitting the third of the chord, which is an A, which is another note within the F chord. And then I'm hitting a B flat, going back to C. And actually I kind of like, let's see. Yeah, let's do that instead, because that gets all those notes in there just to get you all the way back to C. But the other one would use a mixolydian mode, and this would just use chromatics from the F to the A to the B flat to the B to get you all the way back to C. So first we still do our little thing from C to get to F. Then here we're just going to hit it 2 times instead of the third time. And then we're going to go A, B flat, B, C, C, C. And then I usually just like going. And you could also do 2 Cs here and do the chromatic from E all the way to G. So the chords that we're outlining are C, dun, da, 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 F, dun, dun, da, da, C, dun, 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 going to G at the end. So C, arpeggiate to get to F, chromatic back to C, chromatic into G. And then you can go back and start over again. So that's kind of one turnaround that I like to use, but I could do a different one to get there. You know, you can do a lot of different variations, but that's kind of what I like to do. It's just one of those kinds of things, and you're just using the concepts of arpeggiating and chromatically walking up or down one extra step within the other notes just to get your extra way to the next root of the chord. So yeah, so you could do a lot of different things. You could go up the scale, down the scale, just fill in certain gaps with chromatics. We could talk more about which ones are typically used more commonly for the chromatic notes, but I'm not going to worry too much about it in this video. Just know that that's the idea. So with blues, we've covered slow blues, shuffle, and a kind of swing kind of thing where you play more of just the quarter note line. So now we could go into a funky blues, but we haven't talked about funk yet. So I almost feel like we should just talk about funk before going into a funky blues. Because you basically just take the concept of a funk groove and apply it to that 12-bar progression. So a lot of funk is based around one chord. And they'd either do like a dominant 7th chord or a minor chord, depending on the song. Typically, it's not going to be a major chord that you're hanging out on for a long time. So for funk, I kind of like using this like box shape, or like you could use minor pentatonic scale. And then you might even use the blues scale. And you kind of just use different notes out of there. You probably want to have beat 1 represented in funk, because that's really the most important thing that locks in the groove. But then after you play beat 1 or beat 1 and, sometimes you go 1 and with the drums, then after that you can kind of be a little bit busier, and you can kind of do a lot of different things, and there's more 16th note kind of things going on, or a little bit of syncopation for the rest of the measure. You might have stuff like that, or you might have so basically you're centering everything around one chord, but you can use chromatics in other places. Okay, we can talk a little about, so the progressive curmudgeon says, how do you play the Bernadette style? That's more Motown. So I'll include that after this. I wasn't planning on it, but that is a good style to go over. So Bernadette would be more of like a Motown thing. And it has a lot in common with what I'm about to say with funk, but it has some different things. I think we talked a little bit about them a few times ago when I talked about James Jamerson's playing, but I can talk specifically about how to apply it more to that song. But let me get through funk first, which has a lot of things in common, really, with that. With funk, we have, I like doing the blues scale. Sometimes they like doing, sometimes bass lines will be over a dominant 7th chord, but they'll do this chromatic line from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th of the key that you're in. 3rd, 4th, sorry, sharp 4th, 5th. That's what I meant to say. So in the key of C, that would be a C, an E, an F sharp, and a G. That kind of stuff. And then they might add another chromatic note if it was a mixolydian kind of sound, C mixolydian. So they might also occasionally add a chromatic note here so that you end up with all 4 of these in a row as well. Right, so you've got a lot of chromatics that you can use, and then the idea is you syncopate a good amount, but you do want beat 1 to be there usually. Sometimes there's more progressive funk kinds of stuff where you don't play beat 1 and you kind of hide that beat 2. But in general, it's a good idea. If you listen to people like Bootsy Collins talk about it, they're like, that is the funk, is getting that beat 1 really locked in. And you might notice I'm using more ghost notes. That almost sounds like the chicken, but you get an idea. That's kind of a funky groove. That's more like the chicken. But right there, I'm hitting the root. I'm doing that little chromatic thing from the 3rd of the key into the 5th of the key. And then I might even add chromatics here. And then you hear I'm using 16th notes, 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E. You know, there's like 1, a 2, a 3, 4, and so you have more kind of 16th note partials, and you might syncopate them a little bit, which means maybe hiding beat 2 or hiding beat 3. So 1E and a 2E, a 3 and that kind of stuff. So you might hide the downbeats and do a little bit of syncopation within the measure. That kind of stuff, and you can vary kind of through it. Some funk will do a lot of octave stuff, and you might just do a lot of stuff with this kind of grid shape, right? Where you're doing, box pattern. I'll call it a box, where you have like a lot of 3rd frets and a lot of 5th frets. And you might fill in the gap where there'd be the blue note, which is the sharp 4 of the key. So in the key of C, it would be an F sharp. Yeah, and you can kind of vary the rhythm up if your fingers don't lock up on you. Right, and so you can do doubled notes in a row. And you can even add that chromatic note here too. So it's kind of like, this is fair game, these 3 notes are fair game, those 3 notes are fair game. If you want to just use 3 fingers and do this box shape pattern for some funk grooves too. That kind of stuff. So what I'm doing there is mostly hitting beat 1 and then kind of messing around with 16th note partials on the rest of it. What is it? Boom. And so it just depends on how busy the drummer is doing things. You may want to do something a little more straightforward. And if you're doing like James Brown style funk, it's going to be very repetitive. So you might have a really, really cool groove. That kind of thing. And then play it over and over again the same way, which I didn't do there, but you get the idea. Yeah, I can't do it in 2 times in a row, really. And it might be like that. And then, for James Brown, you say, take it to the bridge, and you end up going to the 4 chord usually. That's usually what that means. And sometimes you do stops, at the end or at the beginning of the song, like in Sex Machine or a couple others, but you say like, hit it. And so they go like, bum, 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 bum. So it might be that it hits on the 5, it might be hits on the 4 chord. The bridge usually goes to the 4 chord. And that's general with a lot of styles that if you have a jazz song and it has an A, B, A, that's a first section, a second section, then a bridge, and then back to the first, some variation of the first section. Usually that, not usually, but oftentimes that bridge will modulate to the 4 chord or be centered around the 4 chord. But that's jazz. That's there's a lot to talk about with jazz. So yeah. I have other videos kind of dedicated to walking lines for jazz, and I'll probably have some more jazz stuff coming up if you're interested in that. Okay, so that's kind of the idea with funk. What I would say is different about that and the Motown sound is Motown still has a lot of 16th notes, still has a lot of syncopation, kind of like this. And so that's a lot of the same thing. I'd say roots, fifths, and octaves are very common in Bernadette, and sometimes roots, thirds, fifths, and octaves, I should say. It's just doing the arpeggio. And then kind of when you're on one chord, doing that Motown thing we talked about, the 5-6-1, is kind of common. I mean, honestly, with that one, it's mostly just root, third, fifth octave with different rhythms going on. 1E and a 2E and a 3 and 4. And then just variations on that kind of pattern. But you might do some chromatic walk-ups into certain chords and stuff. But that one's actually not as typical of some of the other Motown ones. But 16th notes, a little bit of syncopation, using arpeggios, and just kind of like applying that through the chords is kind of the idea. And then I mean, there are some parts that do have some 5-6-1. So let me just get the book out and just go through some of the things, but definitely syncopation. Let's see what else we got. Where is it? Bernadette. So at the beginning, it just plays quarter notes to get started, but then it ends up with this like. So that was an example of a chromatic note to connect those two chords together. So we got arpeggio. So dun, 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 dun. So there's some 16th notes going to 8th notes. It's not really that syncopated yet. Another chromatic thing to connect from that chord to the other one. So he's taking the same pattern and the same approach to the new chord down to the next chords. And then this is a really chromatic weird thing that he kind of does. So let's see. Dun, 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 dun. So but that was chromatic up going back into there. There's one part that I really like that's really syncopated in there. And for that part, you're kind of you're doing a lot of playing on the E and the So we got one E and to E and then going back into the normal E and. So he hits another E, then goes and 4 and 1. So it's like you throw in little sections where you're syncopating the 16th notes, but then kind of going back to normal by the end of the measure. So I really like that fill. Right? So that was kind of cool. But those are some ideas of the style. Sometimes you're syncopating by leaving out beat 2 and beat 3 in certain ones. Let's see what happens here. Bum, bum, dun, 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 dun. Oh, that's a... Right. So it's kind of got that same thing. Actually, it's here. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So that one has a little bit more syncopation, and that's kind of a cool way to get from one chord back to the beginning in an interesting way. But the syncopation is tying notes from the of one measure into the of one beat, so like one E and then holding it out through the next one, but then filling in the gaps of 16th notes in really interesting places. So that's kind of the basics with stuff like Bernadette. You're outlining the chords with chord tones and connecting the measures over, and then if you're hanging out on one chord longer than the other ones, or it's just a kind of the end, you're doing some cool rhythm to punctuate going back in, and a lot of times that's syncopating using the 16th notes, so hitting the E's and the U's, and then going back into the normal groove of just kind of accenting where the downbeats are more. Oof. Yeah, so that one's kind of tricky. That's what's cool about James Jamerson and a lot of those other guys that played on Motown stuff, is they knew how to make a line really, really interesting, and they use syncopation. Obviously, just a 16th note feel overall, so it's a very busy sounding line, and then they they do that 5-6 1 thing. There's some very pentatonic sounding stuff mixed in with the chromatics. So it's almost like you're chromatic in this section, then we're connecting it back to this other chord, so we'll do some chromatics instead of pentatonic at that point. So that's kind of the idea there. Pentatonics, chromatics, really interesting rhythms. Okay, so how many styles have we covered? I feel like for an hour we covered country, pop, and rock, basically. I should give you another variation on rock styles. Sometimes people will just do an 8th note chugging rhythm where basically you're just playing a bunch of 8th notes at a time, like in a row. So if you were playing that 1-5-6-4 progression that we were doing, it might sound like punk rock with this progression, but you just play 8th notes, so just 8 of each root. So that's a driving rock rhythm or a punk rock rhythm. Or certain, pop punk, that kind of thing. That'll work for those styles a lot of times, just doing a driving 8th note rhythm. And that's a simple thing to do. You can add some notes from the arpeggios in there. Green Day would add a lot of hammer-on kind of things. And some of these little walk downs that we've been doing in these other styles. Because I think he understands the scales a little bit to be able to add fills like that in. And some other punk players just never wanted to learn theory, so they don't necessarily know that. They kind of rebel against knowing too much, sort of, that sounds bad, but you know what I mean? Some players, it's not about knowing what they're doing. It's just about the attitude of the music. And so sometimes they don't do that. So metal music, you won't typically find 1-5-6-4 very often in metal music. Yeah, Keith, you're right. Worship music does use a lot of driving 8th note rhythms. I'm trying to think of some other things. They also use that other pop kind of idea of just locking in with the bass drum and keeping it simple and sustaining notes. But a lot of times, even when the drummer is playing boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, boom, pop, boom, boom, pop, they want you to play 8th notes all the way through, kind of like you would in punk rock. Same thing. Similar drum rhythm, much faster, but the same beat. With some stuff like that. Yep. And you said the strings, I Can't Live Without You. Yeah, so there's a lot of bands. I mean, I could name like 10 Blink-182 songs that do that. I could do probably a couple Green Day songs that do that kind of thing. Although Green Day's bass player adds more, little flourishes to things, little embellishments. Kind of like you'd have embellishments in Baroque music. And yes, I just compared Green Day to Baroque music, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if people do that, but his bass embellishments are kind of like that, but nothing else about the music really is, except for when they when they use certain chord progressions that were also used in classical music. But yes, but Keith, that was a really good point. Worship music does that, depending on the song. So that's a really good call. So so that's a whole bunch of different styles that you can play. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I missed that I wanted to cover. There are tons of styles that I missed. Like Afro-Cuban rhythms are a lot harder. I think that would take its own dedicated lesson and probably me doing some more research really to do it right. But Afro-Cuban drum rhythms are really awesome. Boom, boom, da, 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 da. It kind of has some cross between 6/8 and 4/4 kind of overlapped, kind of going on, and there's just some cool things that happen. And so you can kind of play, it's like you could play if you were trying to go like 1, 2, 3, 4 and yet go I'm trying to think. I'm gonna mess this up, but it's like you have kind of like a triplet kind of fill in there, but you go back and forth between them. It's confusing. But I should probably go through and figure out. But a lot of times you can play it's almost like a dotted quarter note rhythm, and if you were in you could play something that feels like quarter notes against it, but it kind of sounds strange when you do that. So it works really well with the Afro-Cuban rhythm, but it's like they're not accenting quarter notes where you would be. So you're playing like almost like a different time signature over what they're doing, but it fits. It's kind of weird because they're accenting different notes that make it not feel the same. And then I don't know. There's just a whole bunch of other styles. There's some other like Latin styles and just a whole bunch of other things. There's some where they syncopate so much that you don't play on beat one at all. You just play 1E and 2E and. So you play on the of beat 1, 1E and 2E and then you play on the and of beat 2. So 1E and 2E and 1E and 2E and. You might still do root fifth, but you know, that kind of thing. And there was one other style I wanted to talk about too. Reggae is complicated as well, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit. When you play reggae, the drummer doesn't typically accent the bass drum on beat 1. So if you're used to any other of these styles that I covered, we're almost always hitting beat 1, except for that Latin rhythm I just mentioned, right? And I hate that I don't know the name of that. I think I've heard like Tumbao or something might use that bass line, but you know, I should know the names of the specific styles that use that line, but I've heard different things like that. Harry Styles, that's funny. All the different styles. Shoot, that made me lose my train of thought. But with reggae, the drum beat would be like, the bass drum would be on 2 and 4, and if you're counting it slowly. So if you're going like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So you want to lock in with those. And then you kind of want to syncopate around that, or kind of, you know, embellish around that. But sometimes it's okay for you to play beat 1, but you don't have to. And sometimes there's a lot more space in reggae, and it's interesting space. It's not like I'm going to leave 2 beats of rest and then come in after that in a predictable kind of way. But you might have to like acquaint yourself with playing on 2 and 4. So you don't want to just lock in with 2 and 4. You want to play around that. So if they're going boom, 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 you know, you probably wouldn't want to just do that. So like. So what I like doing is starting on beat 1, but then on the next measure, or basically I guess it would be halfway through the measure, but it feels like the next measure if it's moving that slow, we'd probably just stay on each one of these for 2 beats, because each beat is like da 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 da, you know, dun 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 dun. So even though that's one measure, it feels like 2 measures. So I'm just going to do a 1 5 6 4. We're only on each one for 2 beats since it's a slow rhythm. So I might play boom, 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 boom. Sorry, boom, 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 boom. So you notice how that third was right on that downbeat. Boom, 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 boom. So that's like I'm locking in on those hits on 2 and 4. 1 and 2. Sorry, 1 and 2 and. You know, but that's the important thing. So it's hard to count that and make up stuff at the same time. You get the idea. And then you can kind of syncopate around there, throw in some interesting kind of swung 16th note rhythms. It's almost like we're swinging the 16th notes instead of swinging the 8th notes. You know, that kind of thing. But you really want to hit where beats 2 and 4 are, not skip one like I did like that. But it's not a hard rule that you have to do it every time. It's just kind of like you want to feel that groove going there, and then you can still play around it. You don't have to lock in with every single one. But when you do, it's going to groove harder. So kind of if you don't want it to be that strong of a groove, you can back off from it and then come back to it later. But the bass drum's not on beat 1 and 3, and that kind of throws a lot of people for a loop when they're trying to play some, like, you know, really legitimate reggae stuff. There are some styles within reggae where they might make it more of a dance beat and do 4 on the floor in certain subgenres of it. And you know, a lot of bands like Sublime, they kind of do a fusion of taking some reggae elements with what the guitar is doing with how the bass plays, but the drums might play more of a rock or a punk rock kind of beat underneath it, or a pop beat, just depending. And so mixing all those different things together, it's kind of got, this sort of reggae feel along with some other styles blended in, but it's not straight up reggae. It's not like a Bob Marley song or something, usually the way they play. So that's kind of interesting too. And then ska is like upbeat reggae. And I feel like you hit beat one a lot more there in ska music. Ska music, a lot of times, like the stuff that I've heard, you base it more around arpeggios, but even reggae, you kind of base it around arpeggios. Yeah, so I mean, you can get away with a lot with just using arpeggios and stuff. And yeah, there's a whole lot of styles: dance hall, ska music, just all sorts of things. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how to find your place within a groove. And if you don't, you may not come across all these styles ever, in a playing scenario. But if you do, you'll have more of an idea just from going through this and kind of understanding certain things about each one, rather than just going into it blindly and just saying, oh, I'm playing a reggae song, I wonder if Fruit Fifth, on beats 1 and 3 work on this. And the answer is you can probably play that, but it's not going to sound like reggae when you do that. You can probably play that over these other things if you're just jamming with ukulele players and stuff, but it's going to sound like you're blending styles. Like there are a lot of bands that play things that aren't bluegrass tunes as bluegrass tunes. And Seth, you sent me one. You sent me House of the Rising Sun, only it was in a bluegrass style, and that was really cool. I like that. But they're playing in a bluegrass style, and these are the reasons why. You can tell that the bass is playing root fifth all of a sudden and not just playing the roots. That's another thing. We didn't talk about ballads. Ballads are very sparse, so you could just kind of play whole notes over those and just like less is more on ballads. But occasionally you still have to do little walk-ups to move it forward and stuff. So a ballad would just be like a really slow song. And, the vocals are going to carry a lot more. So you might just be sustaining notes. So you might just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then maybe you might approach certain notes. But it's about not standing out. You're not drawing attention to you, but you'd keep it very sparse and very light underneath most ballads. So ballads are more like whole notes, country's more like half notes, jazz is more like quarter notes when you're walking, and blues, same thing. And if you're doing swing eighth notes, if you're doing a shuffle, then those are swung eighth notes. If you're doing that rock feel or that worship feel that we were talking about earlier, you might do eighth notes. Because it's kind of like in the worship stuff, you're creating different textures. And so that eighth note texture really adds a lot when other people are doing other things. But yeah, so that's kind of a cool idea. I try not to do too much and just, any one thing. I think with the worship music, there are a lot of people on the channel that maybe wouldn't relate. So I just do a little bit here and there just to kind of throw that in. I'm trying to make music for a lot of different people, regardless of, religion and stuff. And it's almost like, it's kind of weird to do like, yeah, worship loves. Yeah. Okay. So worship music, you would do some whole notes and that too. But it's honestly true of pop music and all these other things. There are going to be sections of any of these styles where you want to play more sparsely. And a lot of times it's like with a lot of styles, the intro of songs, like if you listen to production of pop music, the intro of the song won't have any bass, right? And the bass will either come in on, sometimes it comes in on the first verse, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the intro, and this is true of worship music too, sometimes the intro will have bass in it and it'll cut out for the first verse. It's just all about the vocals. It's almost like they're storytelling. So everything gets out of the way except for like maybe an acoustic guitar underneath them, or maybe some really like chill piano or keyboard stuff. And then during the chorus, you might pick back up, and the first chorus is still kind of about sustaining notes and just slightly building. So you might start playing whole notes underneath that. And then in the second verse, the drums might kick in, and then you might start playing eighth notes, and you might start doing some other things like that. But yeah, it is true with the worship music. I think a lot of times, if you don't know the song, you can apply that, and this is the same with pop music too. They have, and don't get mad at me for saying this. They both have formulas, so it's like both of them pretty much. You have like verse, chorus, then eventually you have a bridge, then you have two choruses at the end and some sort of outro, or you just keep doing the chorus on the way out. And so kind of knowing that pop music has song forms like that, and whereas blues will have a different song form. Oh gosh, show tunes. That would be a hard one to do. Show tunes blend everything that we just talked about. And it's like you take all those, you throw them into a blender, you spin it around, and then you like arrange it really, really well. And it's very, very, I don't think you want to fake your way through like musical tunes and show tunes and stuff. Some of the show tunes have that jazz feel, and you do a walking line underneath them, and those aren't really that crazy. Most of them are more arranged and have specific hits, and you really got to know the part and know the song. So faking your way through it would kind of be awful, really, because you'd probably miss a whole bunch of the hits not knowing that they were going to happen. So you just got to be more familiar with that music going into it. And then, Keith says Paul McCartney lines are kind of like show tunes. Kind of. I mean, Paul McCartney, I would say, he does a lot of arpeggios. He has a lot of bounce to it. Like so sometimes he's kind of walking up things, and he'll do a lot of scalar walk-ups and walk-downs. But he also has this bounce to his playing. He's playing with a pick, but he kind of has this like, he kind of has this kind of like, some of the notes are staccato and some of the notes are just kind of, I don't know how to describe it better than a kind of a bouncy feel. And that's not a really good example of his playing. I'm trying to think of some better. But he has a bounce to his playing, and he uses a lot of the same things we're talking about. He uses scales, he uses arpeggios, and then sometimes they just write licks. So you can't always fake a Beatles song because they have so many different genres, once again, blended in. They have a lot of influences. They listen to a lot of different music growing up. You can tell, and you can hear a lot of those different styles come out in their playing. Like Oh Darlin' is completely different than Come Together, which Come Together has, a specific lick that you want to play. But if you're doing that, you're basically going from the root of a minor chord, sliding, or you could hammer on in between, but I like sliding from the fourth to the fifth. And then here, you're sliding up to the, you're sliding to the fifth, then you're hitting the minor third, and then you're hitting the root again. But that's mostly over one chord. And then you take that pattern and move it around when the song moves, and then everything else within Come Together is like eighth note kind of thing. So it's either that or it's the groove or a fill. And he's kind of got that little bounce to it. So yet again, a kind of bouncy feel to it, a little bit of staccato notes. Not everything is super legato, and I don't even know how to describe what gives it the bounce, other than that they're not all legato. He's varying the note lengths to kind of give it kind of a bounce. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Another thing that I want to talk about is just the different styles. You want to play the notes for different lengths. I kind of mentioned this with country. Like I was calling them half notes at first. But if you go, it sounds more country to actually do a quarter note followed by a quarter rest. And then jazz, you might want to play the notes more legato. With the occasional like bounce, like when I did that bump, I did I did add space between those notes because those are kind of a percussive thing too. So hopefully that helps. I think he'd sound bouncy even on a solid body bass, Keith. But yeah, that hollow body does kind of help. I feel like if I use a pick on this, since it has a semi-hollow body, well, this one has a hollow, but his is kind of semi-hollow, I think. But if you play with a pick on the flat wound strings on this, it kind of has a Beatles kind of tone, and so I kind of like that about it too. But it reminds me of his Hofner tone. But he does a lot of different things, with the slides, with all that stuff. So some songs are like that. Then some other songs have a lot of walking. I don't know the bass line to Penny Lane, but that one kind of walks around a lot. So he's doing that too. And yeah, he did play a Rick. I think on Come Together, he might have played a Rick. If I'm not mistaken, I watched a Scott's bass lessons video where he was imitating one of the Beatles songs, and I want to say it was Come Together, and he was talking about how he got that tone out of a Rick. I could be Rickenbacker. I could be mistaken that it was that song, but it was some Beatles song where he was using it. But yeah, so you have a whole bunch of different things within the Beatles where it's kind of like they're borrowing this thing from this style, this thing from this style, and some of it's just kind of his own bounce, just his own kind of like attitude that he brings to it. So a lot of bands are like that, right? If you want to, we didn't cover metal, but if you want to play metal, I think the main thing is just you have to have a lot of speed with your right hand, and the left hand is going to do a lot of either chromatic things, blues scale things, or maybe even Locrian mode if you're doing like really brutal sounding metal. Wow, my hands are too cold to play fast, apparently. I'm making excuses, but yeah, you get the idea. I'm going to pretend my finger's a pick. So you can do that. So a lot of like open strings filling in the gaps between riffs that you do. So that's metal music in a very broad way. There's a lot of specific things that happen. I mean, if you consider Tool metal and all sorts of other things, you have more things. You have a whole lot of things like that. But yeah, there's just like a whole bunch of different things within styles. If it was Tool, I would say it's all about playing things against a drone note, kind of like with metal, like I was just saying. But instead of filling the gaps with a whole bunch of fast notes, they're more sustained notes with interesting rhythms on top, and lots of rhythmic variation, borrowing from music that's not all Western music. Sometimes it's borrowing rhythms from Eastern music. So just some stuff there. Does anybody have any questions about any of these genres or wants to mention one that I may have missed or something? Rockabilly, I guess, is kind of like blues. Like let's say you have that blues walking line, but then you're adding percussive stuff in between. And it's hard to imitate it with the electric bass and really do it justice. I know I made a video on it and everything, but it's hard to get the kind of slap that you would do on upright to sound as fluid on a U bass or an electric bass. So it's just kind of a different thing. Oh, and then within funk, you might want to do some slap bass stuff. I think of slap bass as kind of like imitating a drum set. So what I would always recommend to people when they're starting with slap bass, if you decide to, is treat your thumb like the bass drum and treat the pop like the snare drum. So what I would do to start slapping is first get used to the accuracy of hitting the strings, right, individually. And when you pop, you want to be able to do that. And then you want to find a balance of being able to slap and pop without your hand having to change complete position. So what I'm doing is when I slap, I'm getting my hand ready to pop while doing the slap. If that makes sense. And then I can just imitate a drum set with that. So I could go like bass, snare, bass, bass, snare. And that's a good start. And just start from there And then you can add ghost notes in to make it even more percussive. And then change up where you're doing the pops, so it's more like it's less like where the snare would hit. It's less always on 2 and 4, and you're just kind of varying it up more and more. But at first, I would imitate the drums because it's a very percussive style, and I think that helps. I'm trying to think of other stuff that would help. I feel like if you knew the stuff that I talked about in this video and kind of dived a little bit deeper based on the stuff I was saying and really understood the concepts behind that inside and out, that you'd be able to do a lot of different types of gigs that way. So I think that's all I'm going to cover for today, but hopefully that gives you an idea of a lot of different things you can do within different styles, and just kind of how to get started. Some music you don't really want to fake the bass line, like a lot of the Beatles stuff, you can fake the bass line. You can take the information that a drummer is giving you, take the chords that the guitar player is giving you, and just try to line both those things up, and it'll sound good, but it won't necessarily sound like the original song. So that's kind of another thing. Is occasionally I'll play a jam and somebody will call a song I've never heard before, right? And they'll be playing that. And what I do in those situations is I try to decide, okay, what general style is this? Okay, it's kind of a rock sound or whatever. And I listen to the drummer and I hear what his bass drum is doing. So first, if I have to play right away, with them because we're all jumping in, I'll start with just playing a root note and, figuring out what the chord progression is and just playing beat 1, unless I can hear what the bass drum is doing and immediately feel it, in which case I'll go ahead and match that rhythm while matching when the chords are changing. And so you're the middleman, basically. You're connecting the note information from the guitar to the rhythmic side from the drums. So it's important for you to kind of know what to listen to. Listen to that bass drum rhythm, and then listen to that chordal rhythm. And if there's not a bass drum there, because I know a lot of people complain, well, I don't play with the drummer. And you always say lock in with the drummer. So you lock in with what a drummer would be doing, because you are the drummer at that point. And so if you feel like it sounds like rock, pick one of the rock beats that basically kind of internally, and imitate what the bass drum would do there rhythmically, while taking the chordal information, the root of the chord from the guitar player. So if they're playing a G chord, you play a G note, and that's a basic way to kind of fake your way through a song until you actually know what the bass part is. And you can kind of do walks in between, and there are certain fills that'll just kind of feel natural after you've gone through learning different styles like this. And, if you do it enough, you'll know which things to throw in on which stuff and which stuff not to throw in on other songs. But that's about it for today. Does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff? If you do, just leave it in the comments below, and I'll get back to you later on. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time on Tuesday for the weekly video, and then next Thursday for the live stream. All right. Have a good one. As soon as I figure out how to end the stream.